Joe Biden has threatened Russians with death by publicly authorizing the Ukrainians to use American military equipment to attack inside Russia. How crazy is this?
It's the definition of insanity. First of all, the logic behind this, the Ukrainians have tried to create a narrative that says we can't defend ourselves from Russian aggression emanating from Russian soil unless we are allowed to use all the weapons that we possess. They forget that this is a special military operation that was initiated by Russia in response to Ukraine's 8-year war of aggression against the citizens of Donbass, whom they called terrorists, who they bombarded, killing hundreds of children, thousands of civilians. That this isn't a war. Russia didn't invade Ukraine. Russia sought to bring an end to the Ukrainian actions. And because the United States and other nations have decided to pour in hundreds of billions of dollars in financial and military assistance, this conflict has been extended and turned into a proxy war between Ukraine and Russia. This isn't about Ukraine wanting to use these weapons. This is about the United States and its NATO allies seeking to use Ukraine as a proxy to inflict the maximum possible damage on Russia. But the fallacy here is they say, well, Russia can't be allowed to have a safe haven on Russian soil from which they get to launch an attack. Well, what do you think all of NATO and Europe is from the Russian perspective? It's a safe haven for Ukraine. You know, they train Ukrainian pilots. If that was training was done in Ukraine, they'd all be dead. We repair the Ukrainian equipment, American equipment, German equipment. We repair it on Polish soil, on German soil, in the Baltic states. Repair facilities are legitimate military targets. When you take a tank off the battlefield, take it back to repair it, to bring it back to the battlefield, that needs to be attacked. All the warehouses where we flow in these hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment on Polish soil, Romanian soil, etc., they can't be attacked by Russia. Ukraine has this massive safe haven, which Russia is powerless to attack. And this is the danger, because if we start playing this game and attacking the Russians have made it quite clear that they will retaliate, not just on Ukrainian soil, but on the soil of NATO nations. And this heads us down a very dangerous path that could very well lead to nuclear war.
Here's Foreign Minister Lavrov basically saying we will not put up with this. Cut number 1.
We have shown that we will not put up with this, and that we will not allow Ukraine to be used as a direct threat to our security, as an instrument for the destruction of everything Russian on historical Russian lands. They did this for more than 2 decades, or even 30 years, immediately after the disappearance of the Soviet Union. Their goal was to destroy everything Russian, from the language to the government in this territory, which they wanted to take for themselves. And they were counting on it. But as always happens, if they wake up the Russian bear, then our people have united like never before. These are not empty words. We saw this during the Russian presidential elections. The Nazi regime continues to use Western weapons to attack civilian targets, towns, and cities. I assure you that they will not be able to cross this line unnoticed.
Does Joe Biden, does Tony Blinken, does Rishi Sunak, does Emmanuel Macron, does Olaf Scholz, does Donald Tusk, president of Poland, do these folks understand the significance of what Foreign Minister Lavrov said, and that the Russians don't bluff?
No, if they did, they wouldn't be going this far down this path. They are being advised by people who are saying that the Russians are bluffing, that the Russians lack the capacity to back these words up with meaningful force. There's even people who say, look, Russia's focused on the BRICS summit in October and, on bringing the non-aligned world together. Why would Russia risk, a war with the West? Well, because the West is threatening Russia's existential survival. And this is the danger. I mean, even President Putin came out today and said, this is a very dangerous game that's being played that will have fatal consequences for the United States. Judge, in retrospect, it might be a good thing that you and I didn't go to Russia, because I'm very fearful that while the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is underway, that a red line will be crossed and Russia will respond, and we will be looking at an outbreak of actual war between the United States and Russia. This is why I wanted to travel, because I was hopeful that by speaking to the Russian government, speaking to the Russian people, speaking to the Russian nation about the potential of the American people to do the right thing, come November, maybe vote in somebody who isn't hell bent on going to war with Russia, that the Russians might not be inclined to act precipitously when we cross these red lines. But I was denied that opportunity by the U.S. government, and now, sadly, there's no voice in Russia right now, American voice, that can caution this. The U.S. embassy isn't. We don't have an American ambassador that's meeting with the Russians on a regular basis saying, this is all misunderstanding. What do we need to do to avoid war? We have a U.S. government together with NATO allies that think Russia's bluffing, and they are seeking to put as much pressure on Russia as possible prior to this peace summit that's being convened by Ukraine and Switzerland in the middle of this month, a peace summit that's falling apart before it even begins. But the operating notion is that we must convince Russia that we are serious about the consequences Russia will accrue if it continues military engagement against Ukraine, that Russia's only choice is to be compelled to the peace table. Russia's not playing that game. Russia's playing the game of, we've won this war, and if you want to make it a broader war, we'll win that war too.
Here's how serious Russia takes it. Here's another statement. This is a full screen. We don't have it on tape. From Foreign Minister Lavrov. I'll read it aloud for the benefit of those who are taking the show audio only. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on May 30th. We do not rule out additional steps in the sphere of nuclear deterrence because our command centers and the locations of our nuclear forces will be in range of American forward-based missiles. This is about as serious as you can get.
There's a lot of Americans out there. They're in the armchair warrior category, who are like, unleash the ATACMS. The ATACMS, of course, is the long range, up to 300-kilometer range missile that we have provided to the Ukrainians. Ray McGovern, and next time you have Ray on, you can talk to him about this, has highlighted some of the negotiations are taking place between the Russians and the United States before the initiation of the special military operation. And the Russians kept saying, we can't let NATO into Ukraine because we can't allow American missiles into Ukraine, because a lot of these Russian facilities, command centers, etc., that Russia uses were conceptualized and constructed during the Soviet Union when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So from a Russian perspective, they were deep in the Russian rear, protected. But if Ukraine now is carved out, made part of NATO, and you insert American missiles there, all of these places that were thought to be safe in the rear are now reachable. And if America allows Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles to strike these facilities, Russia will nuke NATO, not Ukraine, NATO. And this is what Lavrov just said. If you do this, now, according to the Ukrainians, they're complaining that the United States will only allow them to use the HIMARS, that they won't be allowed to use the ATACMS to strike Russia yet. But just so everybody in your audience understands, we are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying. We are one ATACMS launch away from everybody dying. The Russians aren't playing games here.
The Russians will, and they will be well-grounded morally and legally, attack the places from which the missiles came, to which the missiles were delivered, at which their accelerant facilities are stored and repaired. And many Americans who are manning those facilities. Do we have any idea how many Americans are dead already? Didn't the Russians recently attack some NATO facility and you hear nothing, with 100 people died, and you hear nothing about it in the West?
Well, I'm always a little leery of these reports about the magic Russian missile that hit a underground bunker, because there's no reason for NATO, the United States, to hazard NATO members or American members. Remember, I talked about that safe haven. Why put 300 people into Ukraine in a bunker when you could have 300 people in Poland in a bunker that's not going to get hit by a Russian missile and have the same connectivity. So I always view these reports as a little suspicious, and it just makes no sense that from a force protection standpoint, I can't see any American or NATO member allowing that many Americans or NATO officials to congregate in one place on Ukrainian soil, knowing that the Russians would find it and destroy it. I do believe the Russians did take out an underground facility. It's a facility that was used by the Ukrainians. There may have been some NATO advisors or contracted personnel, but the idea of 300 Americans and NATO soldiers or officials dying in one attack, I just think it's far-fetched and just part of the fiction that often appears on social media.
Do you think Russia would attack Berlin, Paris, London?
Russia has said they will attack Berlin, Paris, London, Brussels. Russia will attack the decision-making centers associated with any attack against Russia that Russia deems to represent an existential threat. Let's get back to the ATACMS. The ATACMS system uses a guidance system, a GPS guidance system backed by an inertial guidance system that requires specific information to be loaded into the system. That can only be done by an American. I'll just repeat that one more time. That can only be done by an American.
Got to be top secret, whatever it is.
And now it's not just, now we get to the next part. That information will be transmitted from collection platforms, overhead satellites, drones, other ground and air breathing intelligence collection resources. They collect data. That data goes to a center inside Poland or in Germany, where that data is collated and then used to create a target, model of data against a specific target. What target's going to be attacked, how they're going to attack it, with what, from where. That data then is put together into a target package, which is transmitted again using top secret, communications channels that the Ukrainians don't have access to. So we have somebody on the ground in Ukraine receiving this package from somebody who planned it outside of Ukraine, and then they will put it into the missile, and then the Ukrainians do the last part, which is to push the button and launch it. But every other aspect was done by American hands, and the Russians know this. And so wherever in Europe this planning is taking place, this collation of intelligence data, this communication of targeting data, these are now legitimate targets that Russia will take out, either conventionally or, if required, using nuclear weapons. And if the Germans are party to this, Macron needs to understand if the Ukrainians use the French-provided Scout missiles, the same thing applies. The targeting data that goes inside can only be put in place by a French actor. There's the missile I used to inspect, and that is a game changer. If that's ever used in anger, we will lose 1 to 3 American cities.
Do the Russians have missile capability that we cannot intercept or neutralize?
Yes, pretty much every modern Russian missile is designed to evade American and NATO missile defense. On the strategic level, they have hypersonic missiles. They have maneuvering hypersonic warheads. They have similar capabilities at the tactical and what's called intermediate level. We can't defend against this. And the bottom line is that the Russians launch the missiles, those missiles will hit the targets they're aimed at. And if those targets, if those missiles have nuclear weapons, those nuclear weapons will detonate where they're supposed to. And this will be devastating. It will be the end of Europe at a minimum, and potentially the end of the United States and the end of Russia and the end of the world.
Do Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Austin, etc., President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, understand the gravity of this moment as you've explained it? Or are they just propagandists?
I used to have a friend named William Polk, and I say used to because tragically he passed away a couple of years ago. But William Polk was a man who was in the inner circle for John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he talks about, and he's talked to me many times about the decision making that was going on and the role that Kennedy played in preventing a nuclear war, the maturity Kennedy had as a leader. Part of that maturity came from when Kennedy was first briefed on what was then called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, the PSYOP, the American War Plan. He went to the Pentagon and they briefed him. They said, this is, if we go to nuclear war, this is what we got. And basically, it was premised on the notion that America will be the largest surviving civilization, but in order to guarantee that, we have to kill everybody in the world. And he came out and said, that's insane. I'm not doing that. And he turned to his advisor. He said, and we call ourselves the human race. And he said, you have to give me options. Every president since then, or up until George W. Bush, reacted the same way. When they first got that briefing on how America plans to go to war, which is to destroy the entire world so that when the 20 to 30% of America that survives will be the largest remaining civilization cluster in the world, guaranteeing American global dominance in a post-nuclear conflict. Insanity. They all said the same thing. Insane. Give me options. I can't go to that. You can't make me do this. You have to give me options. And the Pentagon always gave them options that inevitably led to that. Since the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans have downplayed their nuclear war plan. We detargeted our missiles. Nothing was on automatic anymore. We were heading in a path of, getting rid of nuclear weapons. And then George W. Bush came into post 9/11 environment and said, we will use our nuclear weapons to ensure that a 9/11 never happens again. And we reinserted nuclear war planning into our military doctrine. And today we have that same mindset, that same nuclear war strategy without the maturity of John F. Kennedy. We have people who look at the plan and say, well, that's just a plan. We're not really going to do that. And they say the Russians are bluffing. We don't have to worry about this. The problem is the second something happens and that plan is pulled out, the dust is brushed off, and we start pushing buttons, we go to the scenario that John F. Kennedy said was insanity. Judge, we're going to blow up the entire world because we know that in a post-nuclear environment, we can't allow, for instance, India to survive intact because we're going to be reduced to 30% of our capacity. We can't allow India to have a superior civilization in a post-nuclear conflict. We're going to destroy the entire world. That's what the American nuclear war plan is. And the American people need to wake up and understand it's on full automatic. Full automatic.
You see why the state, almost said CIA, but I see why the State Department's afraid of you, because you speak the truth, because you give an understanding that the government doesn't want people to have. And a 45-year-old JFK had more maturity, understanding, and grasp of morality than an 81-year-old barely competent Joe Biden.